2, 3, 4. In this video on further vocal techniques and arrangement, we'll look at a few ways the Beatles could ornament their vocals. We'll then examine different ways in which two vocal lines can relate to each other, and finish up with a look at the Beatles' three-part singing. There are three basic vocal techniques characteristic of embellishments to an underlying clean vocal sound in the early Beatles: multiphonics, falsetto, and florid ornamentation. Multiphonics is just a $10 word for shouting, which produces a wide range of non-harmonic sounds along with the fundamental frequency. It was one way to excite their audience, particularly when both John and Paul would shout to call forth a guitar solo, as in One After 909 and Lend Me Your Comb. But each of these two frequently shouted their way through a song, as when Paul imitated Little Richard in Long Tall Sally or Lucille, or John evoked Larry Williams in Dizzy Miss Lizzie, Bad Boy, or Slow Down, perhaps shouting at his best in Leave My Kitten Alone and Mr. Moonlight. The occasional shouting that the Beatles provided My Bonnie while backing lead singer Tony Sheridan is actually the aspect of the record that sounds most like the later Beatles. But multiphonics can be subtle, as when John modulates his voice expressively in the second bridge of Anna. Falsetto is, in one way, the opposite of multiphonics. With this technique, the singer filters out the lower vocal tones, leaving only a light and artificially high register. Woo! Taken largely by Paul from Little Richard's repertoire, this is the woo with which John and Paul punctuate the most exciting moments of their songs. See, for instance, 1 minute and 2 seconds into She Loves You. John claimed that he had the more reliable falsetto, and he does add this color to many recordings, such as in the Coda of Misery, but it is Paul who recreates exactly the same two falsetto pitches once used at the end of Love of the Loved to nail the ending of Please Please Me. Also listen for the falsetto-based yodeling sound that Paul produces in Lend Me Your Comb. Through florid ornamentation, the Beatles transcend the hard business of declaiming rock and roll and approach artistic expression in their melodic thinking. They sing more than one note, sometimes many notes per syllable. It could be awkward in the early years, as when Paul sings I, and you, in Like Dreamers Do. And John does a little more soulfully with I in Ask Me Why. John ends the bridge of This Boy, the song's emotional high point, with a melisma on Cry, High. See if you can hear where George sings short melismas in Take Good Care of My Baby and The Sheik of Araby. One small melismatic ornament deserves mention, the mordent, which is most characteristic of John's singing. Oh, you hear that rapid upper neighbor to the principal note? That's a mordent. There's a Place is a song that begins with both John and Paul singing melismas on the word there, and the melisma of each verse is amplified by the stop time of the instrumentation. There. Notice how, when singing the words mind, time, and you later in the song, John moves from the principal note to its upper neighbor and back. In Ain't She Sweet, John adds dirty multiphonics to his mordent on the word you in the phrase, I ask you. Paul's mordents can be heard ornamenting the top part in the three-part vocals of This Boy. The Beatles added a lot of variety to their vocal textures, with varied contrapuntal relationships between their singing parts. As we've seen, sometimes two singers will move in parallel motion, maintaining the same interval between them as their melodies progress, most often in parallel thirds or sixths or fourths. At other times, two could sing in similar but not parallel motion, where the two parts would move up or down together but with changing intervals. Sometimes the two vocal parts would move in contrary motion, and occasionally one would sustain an unchanging pitch while the other moved up or down, producing what we call oblique motion. Some forms seem to lock the singers together, whereas other results emphasized more independence between the two.
Let's demonstrate with a few examples. We've already explored the sweet sound of parallel thirds and sixths in both vocal and guitar line pairs. Sometimes a hollower sound was achieved with parallel fourths. In the opening line of "You Really Got a Hold on Me," Paul and George sing entirely in similar motion, nearly all of it in parallel fourths. That's because George mostly sings the fifth scale degree, ornamenting it with its upper neighbor, the sixth scale degree, while Paul sings mostly a fourth above that, anchored on the first scale degree with other material above that. You can hear John and Paul with this effect in Sure to Fall. It's unusual in the early Lennon and McCartney compositions, but see if you could hear an example of parallel fourths in Thank You Girl.
The bridge of I'll Get You, with its similar motion among changing intervals, comes directly from the refrain of the Crickets' Don't Ever Change. In this B-side to She Loves You, John and Paul both descend, but they move from a third through a fourth to a fifth, and then from a third through a fifth to a sixth, like this. Da 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 da. John and Paul are together rhythmically, but sparkle in their constantly evolving musical relationship of changing intervals.
We demonstrated contrary motion back when we introduced scales, showing how Paul sang an ascending scale while he played a descending scale on the bass in All My Lovin'. Such contrary motion could be concentrated in a much smaller space, as when John and Paul went in separate directions in There's a Place, John adding some pungently dissonant mordents to his lower part. You might notice some contrary motion in Love Me Do as well. John and Paul seem to emulate the oblique motion with which the Everly Brothers open Kathy's Clown in both Love Me Do and Please Please Me. But a great example of vocal oblique motion takes place in the bridge of I Saw Her Standing There. Here, Paul crosses up and down against John's static, unchanging voice, depicting both the standing and the crossing they sing about.
One other aspect of counterpoint should be noted, the countermelody. With this, a tune that had been heard alone in an early verse is given a new secondary melody with its own rhythm to provide a fresh sound to a later verse. In this way, John adds a descending countermelody to Paul's tune in their December 1962 cover of Falling in Love Again, recorded at the Star Club in Hamburg. It's only in their middle years that the Beatles introduced this idea into their own writing.
When three Beatles sing through a song, it's usually with one taking the lead and the other two together in backing roles, often simply sustaining oohs in harmony. Of dozens of such arrangements, only in Three Cool Cats and Devil in Her Heart does George take the lead in early Beatle recordings, although his part is featured in the three-part Chains. Ringo takes a turn in Boys. Surprisingly, rarely does Paul sing lead with John and George backing. Examples do include Love of the Loved, Besame Mucho, the chorus of All My Loving, and the coda of Kansas City.
John's lead vocal is very often backed by the other two, Paul above George, as in To Know Her Is to Love Her, Baby It's You, Soldier of Love, and the bridge of All I've Gotta Do. In the two instances when John, Paul, and George all sing the same words in the same rhythm, George has the lead part in Chains, and John does in This Boy. Listen to some of these numbers and compare how nonsense scat syllables are used in gospel-inspired responses. And see if you can identify the three singers and their roles in Anna, Please Mr. Postman, and I Just Don't Understand. The Beatles' approach to vocal writing will become further varied in later recordings, and counterpoint among instruments will also show imaginative growth in approaches as the group matures. All of this will be explored in later videos.